Good afternoon, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for asking me to come and give a webinar to you. Yeah, negotiating across borders and cultures. Funnily enough, sometimes when I prepare this negotiation seminar, what's actually come up more often is that some of the fundamental concepts that we generally work with, aren't as common as I had thought they were. So we all come to negotiations with certain assumptions. So rather than spending a great deal of time on cross-cultural differences and cross-cultural characteristics, what I thought I would do would be to just, along with incorporating those within this seminar, would be to take a couple of concepts that might not be as common as we think they are. So I'll put that at the very beginning in case you think to yourself, oh, there wasn't a huge amount of cross-cultural issues, but that's the reason why. And as I go through this presentation, I'll highlight them. So first of all, the learning outcomes for this afternoon is to define what is meant by negotiation and apply that to a number of different contexts, including cross-culturally. Identify factors that can determine the outcome of a negotiation and understand the principle of win-win negotiations. So how I'm tackling this afternoon's session is talk about the nature of negotiation, types of negotiation outcomes, some cultural characteristics, the negotiation process, something called BATNA, and then we'll talk about you and factors of success. So just to begin, we'll talk about the nature of negotiation. So what is negotiation? So negotiation is about getting the best possible deal in the best possible way. So negotiation takes place when two or more people with differing views come together to reach an agreement. And this agreement will usually take place through bargaining, trading, bartering, and hopefully not bullying one person into submission, and you win and they lose. So definitions of negotiation, and here are three that I like. Negotiation is any discussion to get a mutual agreement between two or more people. Negotiation is about reaching agreement with other parties so that you can achieve your goals. And negotiation involves an element of trade or bargaining, an exchange of valuable resource for another to enable both parties to achieve a satisfactory outcome. And I think this third one is the real element of negotiation. It's trade or bargaining to enable both parties to achieve a satisfactory outcome. And what you're trade or bargaining with is a valuable resource, something that might be valuable to them, but just a resource to you, or vice versa, so that, you know, together you can get a win-win situation. Now, I was delivering this particular lecture or seminar when I was in Bahrain, and I also did it to a group of diplomats. So many of the quotations and things that I had came from the world of diplomacy, and this is one of them. So Winston Churchill in 1954, when talking to a group of journalists, this is after the Second World War, and Winston Churchill was British Prime Minister during the time of the Second World War for the UK. He said, to jaw is always better than to war. And I think diplomats throughout the world will say that, and then civilians like us will agree with that too. So let's hope, bearing in mind what's going on in the world at the moment, that we can get politicians to focus on that, more jaw and less war. And every now and then in the session, I'm going to go to now for something completely practical. So when we're talking about negotiation, what you really have to do is remember that in the middle of negotiation, ego can get in the way. So your ego, your pride, your honor, it can be the enemy. So remember, in negotiation, don't let your ego or anybody else's ego get in the way of your settlement. Remember, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. And this was a lesson that was being drummed into me by one of the specialist negotiation trainers that I know. He always said to me, Debbie, you never get the salary you deserve, you never get the fees you deserve, you only get the ones that you negotiate. So it's a lesson for us all. So negotiation is a skill acquired through practice and by learning the right techniques. And they say you can't expect to be successful in business unless you are a good negotiator. But that doesn't mean only for business. It can mean for diplomacy, for education, and for all walks of life. And as I just said, negotiating for a good salary. Now, the thing about negotiation is most people know what to do, and then they don't do what they know. It's an experienced negotiator will always tell you it's what you learn when you know it all that really counts. So let's talk about the different types of negotiation outcomes that you can have. Now, when I do this in a workshop, I usually set off with giving them, my participants, this particular activity. So they've got $1,000 to share between them. And the only rule is they mustn't divide this 50-50. So you can't take $500 each. And I give them 5 minutes to come to a negotiated settlement. So can I leave you with the concept of this idea of the activity? You've got $1,000 and you've got to share it between you. So, you know, you're both happy. Anybody looking at the outcome would say, yes, it was a win-win for both parties. And the only rule is you can't you can't divide it equally. Well, the first time I did this in an African country, it was Malawi, and I got such a surprise at the outcomes that came out of the activity, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So let's talk about the 4 outcomes that you can get for a negotiation. So if in our, as I always say, an MBA is a Master of Boxes and Arrows. So in our boxes and arrows diagram, we're comparing you and me. So the 4 outcomes we could get are, at worst, it would be you lose and I lose. So we have a lose-lose combination. We can always get a win-lose. That's where I win and you lose, or lose-win, in which case you win and I lose, or a win-win, so that both parties can come away happy. So let's go back to this idea of reaching a settlement. Now, if we do $490 and $510, it's almost 50-50, but it's definitely a win-lose for somebody. And an observer would say, well, that's not win-win. You could, for example, decide that both parties would take $450 each, and then give $100 to charity, in which case, yeah, an observer would say, well, that's a win-win, and it's a bit of a bonus because charity is getting $100 each. But actually, what working in Malawi taught me was that there were people that were in a negotiation very, very willing to give almost everything back to their negotiating opposition. And when I asked them why, it was always a matter of, well, if I give this to them now, there is, at some time in the future, they will help me out. So in my doctorate, when I was doing knowledge across cultures and different international practices across cultures, I came up with the concept of mutual debt societies, or mutual debt cultures, which for a British culture doesn't exist. So what I mean by that is that in the UK, we would be taught, or it would be normal practice to go for a win-win. Whereas I've now found out that in other cultures, win-win isn't a concept that is readily to mind or readily part of the culture, especially if you come from a mutual debt, what I call a mutual debt culture. So if somebody helps you, you are on a bound to help them at some point in the future. Which then got me thinking that there is a 5th outcome, and that is when successful negotiation is not confrontational, as I would know it in my own culture, but you negotiate for a win-win-win, and that's where you get more than just a win-win. So, for example, this is where you start looking for alternatives. So somebody, for example, with their $1,000 might want to have a family holiday, but $1,000 isn't going to actually take them very far, not for a whole family. But the person they're negotiating with might have a sister who's got a holiday home somewhere where they're quite happy with $1,000, and they can go there to the sister's place for a holiday, and then the person who they're negotiating with can then do something for the sister. So you start looking at different positions and different ideas and really thinking outside the box. What can you trade this $1,000 for, or this 490 and 510? You know, you turn it into something else. So most people think that in negotiation, bargaining and negotiation mean the same thing. However, there is a distinction, and what we tend to mean by bargaining is usually a competitive win-lose situation, where negotiation really does refer to win-win situations, as those that occur when parties try to find mutually acceptable solutions to a complex conflict. So look for the needs of the other party, and hopefully you will get more than win-win. You'll get that fifth way where you get the win-win-win. So let's now talk about BATNA. Now, I thought most people had heard about this acronym BATNA, but it turns out many people haven't. So let's have a look at what it means. So BATNA it's a shortened version of best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So going into negotiation, what you need to do is know your best agreed outcome. So you know your BATNA, and very, very importantly, you know your walkaway position. You know when to give up and not be pushed further. And all these things are part of your preparation. So it's important to know your positions. And if you're negotiating with a team, or sorry, if you have a team that's with you in the negotiations, it's important that you are all clear on the positions. And those positions are your best position, your target position, your walkaway position, and your alternative position. And what that means is I'm always putting things into diagrams and models. It means that you, in any negotiation, you have a zone of potential agreement, and you as a negotiating partner need to understand all your positions. And you know, one of the games of negotiation is trying to guess, determine, and define what you think the positions are for the other party. So you've got to do some planning, and you've got to do some preparation in your negotiation. So to plan, you need to establish your objectives, try and establish the other party's objectives, frame your negotiation so that it's a joint search for a solution, so that becomes a win-win-win. Identify the areas that you have for agreement, and then troubleshoot your disagreements. So bargain and seek alternative solutions and introduce trade-offs, but make sure that your areas of agreement are already established, so they don't then become part of your trade-offs. And finally, you know, your agreement and close, summarize and ensure acceptance. So in terms of the negotiation process, we say that there are 5 phrases. your preparation, your introduction and entry, which is setting the stage, information gathering and exploration of interests. And this is when you really need to know your positions, and what you're trying to do now is sound out the other party's positions. Then you start bargaining, and then you get to agreement, your finalization and closure. So what do you do when you prepare? So know what you want to achieve, predict what the other side wants to achieve, study the other side's negotiation culture, know your walkaway position, your BATNA, present your case, and then the other side will present their case. And as you're doing this, you should be aware of 5 key questions. Why am I here? You know, why is it me doing the negotiation? Why they should talk to me? What can I offer that they need? What outcome do I want? And what's my fallback position? And in determining those questions, you will need to have some essential research done. So it's the history of the relationship, especially in diplomatic relations, you know, when two sides are coming together, you know, what's been going on before. Very interestingly, the chap I was speaking about just now, who's the master negotiation trainer that I know, he used to work for an international bank, and he said he was sent to South Korea to finish off some negotiations which had miserably failed. And he said, I looked into the negotiation and what had been happening, and he said we'd sent 2 parties over to negotiate, and they'd come back without any agreement at all. He said, so there was me one day flying British Airways to South Korea, and I, you know, I was trying to prepare for this negotiation. And he said, actually, what happened, no preparation could have really readied me for what actually happened. But when I walked into the door, through the door for negotiation, I realized what had been going wrong beforehand. And he said, here was me, a lone person from London, going in to negotiate with a very big bank in South Korea. And I walked through the door, and there sat 20 people. And there was only me from London. And he said, and I realized what had gone on before. We'd only sent teams of 2 or 3 people to negotiate. This time round, they were sending only me. And what I had to do was persuade the South Korean bank that the British way of doing negotiation was to send only the person who had the authority to negotiate. So they'd had 3 people before, and it wasn't actually an insult to them that only 3 people turned up, compared with the 20 that were turning up from the South Korean bank, to show how important this negotiation was to them. And Derek was saying that it took, you know, some persuasion to help them to see that it wasn't an insult to South Korea that they'd only sent a few people. It was a great honor to only send a few people, because we only sent the best in the first place. So, you know, little differences about how many people turn up, who should be turning up, and to help the different parties understand the cultural differences in negotiation. So Derek came back from South Korea with a deal done, but he said, you know, the sweat was on his brow. He had to wipe it off because he suddenly realized that the people in South Korea thought that London was not honoring them enough, not giving them enough face, and they took it as an insult that so few people turned up for important negotiations. So there's a lesson to be learned there. So what's the history of the relationship? What caused the impasse? What's the nature of the opposing negotiator? How badly do they need a settlement? What are their real needs? And do they need to save face? So all these things begin to be part of your essential research. And then your checklist is prepare all your points to cover and ensure that the whole of your team knows. Collate supporting material. Devise sequences for incremental gains. So every time that you reach an agreement and something's gained, get that agreement and consolidate each agreed point. I hope that's clear for you. And now for something completely different or practical. What actually is being traded? Well, as the Derek South Korea story highlights for us, it's not always issues that on the table. In terms of Derek's story, it was about recognition, and it was a pride. But it can also be security and resources, it can be control, it can be reputation, it can be time or risk. It's not just about the story that we think we're coming, that's bringing us together. We need to go deeper, and we need to understand that there's a lot more layers in our negotiation than we might initially think. I think for people who come from especially a UK, USA background, we tend to take things at face value, but there's lots and lots of cultures that have a lot of context to them. So this is where the layers can get deeper. But it's and this is a cultural difference. So high context cultures, as we would call them, cultures that have a lot of hidden culture within them, compared with what we would call low context cultures, which we could say were West Europe, Northern America, Anglo cultures. The layers tend to be less deep because there's less context. But even so, there's lots of issues that have a lot of context to them. So if I were just to briefly mention the Brexit layers, you know, the Brexit issue wasn't just about you know, the UK leaving the EU. It wasn't Brexit, just Brexit per se. It was the UK versus EU. It was London versus Paris, Berlin versus Brussels, member states versus Commission, the UK versus Ireland versus Northern Ireland. Especially for the Brits, it was the fish versus finance, and optimism versus pessimism. There was so many layers all wrapped up in Brexit, about expectations as well, about the future, and the history of what had been going on before. If we unfortunately look at the Ukraine-Russia issue, it's Russia versus Ukraine. You've got Russians versus Russians. You've got Russia versus US versus EU versus NATO. East versus West versus South. Power versus rules. Strong versus weak. Security versus identity, and versus pride. And this last one is such a big issue. So negotiation, remember, there are layers upon layers. And so in terms of many of the Soviet and Russian negotiations that we've seen going on as currently or in the past, very often we look back and we can see that their stance has been, we're tougher than you can imagine. We can take more pain than you can inflict. However, you hurt us and we'll hurt you more. So a lot of psychological pressure is going on there. Which brings me now to some cultural characteristics. I'm sure that many of you know a model by Richard Lewis. It's called the linear active, or the LMR model. I love this model. I find it one that explains fairly simply a complex concept. So Richard Lewis says basically there are three different types of culture in the world, and he colors them blue, red, and yellow. In the blue corner, you have linear active cultures. This is where direct communication is allowed, and people tend to do one thing at a time. They tend to do things linearly. So in these cultures, people can think about, this is where I am now, this is where I want to be in the future, and these are the steps that can take me to the future. So I can plan, schedule them, put in some milestones, and it becomes a matter of fact, good management and good organization to reach the goal of in the future. So basically the cultures that fall into that category are Northwestern Europe, North America, and the Anglo-Saxon cultures. So quite direct communication, and we're not particularly expressive. Then you have the red cultures, who are very, very expressive, very loquacious, lots of words. They're very warm, very emotional, and they tend to do many things at the same time. So if you go into a butcher's shop and you are being served, the butcher will probably serve you, but because he's chopping up salami, he'll ask anybody else in the shop, oh, anybody else wants salami, and he'll serve that salami at the same time. So many things go on at the same time. You could go into a meeting and expect to be having a private meeting with somebody, or a meeting with a set agenda, but actually you find that people are having mini meetings in the meeting. They're talking on the phone, or they're going out to talk to somebody else, and lots of things are happening at the same time. This culture comprises the Latin Americans, the southern Mediterranean countries, and northern Africa, that sort of feel. And then you get the yellow cultures, and they are very silent. Harmony is it's very important to them. They're very patient, and they can wait, and they're very courteous. And those cultures tend to come from the Far East. So in between the blues and the reds, you get other cultures, especially sort of Poland and other European countries. Between the red and the yellow, lots of the Arab and South Asian cultures. And between the blue and the yellow, you will actually find along that spectrum people, the UK is on that spectrum just, and Finland, because they are very culturally silent. So the reds are very expressive. The blue cultures are not so expressive. The yellow cultures tend to be inscrutable. They're not expressive at all. Which then brings me to Erin Mayer's table, where she compares and contrasts different cultures on a boxes and arrow map. So what she's comparing here is cultures that are from left to right, those who do confrontation, those cultures that avoid confrontation, and then from top to bottom, those cultures that are emotionally unexpressive compared with those who are emotionally expressive. Now, I won't go through all of these for you, but I have got the slides for you, so you can look at this afterwards. But let's just sort of take one of each. So emotionally unexpressive and avoids confrontation. So in this bottom right hand corner, you've got the UK falls in there, but you've got Japan that falls in there as well. So they don't like confrontation, and they're always trying to be courteous. On the other side, emotionally unexpressive, but can be confrontational. You've got the German culture, and the Netherlands fall in very, very similarly there. And in the top half, emotionally expressive, but doesn't like confrontation, you've got Saudi Arabia. And then on the other side, emotionally expressive, but confrontational, you will see that the US just about fits into that top left-hand box, but you've got Russia and Israel in there. And interestingly enough, from a UK perspective, you know, when anybody talks to me about, what about dealing with the Russians or dealing with the Israelis, as a UK person, I put my hands up and say, oh, don't talk to me, because they always seem to be hardballing. But that's because I come from a culture that's so diametrically opposed from my comfort zone that people from cultures such as the top left-hand corner, you know, for me, are really difficult to negotiate with. I can negotiate outwards, or I can negotiate sidewards, but to go diagonally opposite is very difficult. And actually, most people would say the same thing. So now for something completely practical. So your key skills is active listening. So a Russian proverb is, one should not hurry to reply, one should hurry to listen. So be silent, don't interrupt. Listen for words and feelings, interpret body language, assess, but don't judge, because your assessment could be, or your judgment could be wrong. Just assess what's going on, observe, without actually giving judgment. And remember, silence can be a tactic to force concessions. And the Finns are masters at this. They just remain silent, and you end up blabbing and giving things away, because the Finns just sit there, no emotion and in silence. And Chinese proverb, those who know do not speak, and those who speak do not know. So just a few basics about how to play the game. Strategy always follows structure, but the point about strategy and structure is you can shape the game as well as play it. So rules are influenced by the actions of participants, and somebody may well try to force a certain type of rule on you, but or agenda, but you know, you don't have to accept it. You know, you can move this. You can, as well as them shaping it, you can shape it. So what are the rules of the game in the negotiation that you're doing, and how can you shape them? So what you need to do is think strategically, but act opportunistically. Expect to be surprised and to modify your initial approach, especially with the hard ballers. And now for something completely practical. So how do you rate yourself as a negotiator? Are you a beginner, an intermediate? Are you good, or or what? I have an assessment that you can do, and I've attached it to the end of the PowerPoint slide that I have sent to be shared with you. So I'd like you at this moment in time just to quickly give yourself a mental note on how you rate your skills on a scale of 0 to 100. 0 being not very good and 100 being spectacular. Okay, so just bear that in mind. So what stops many people negotiating? It's that they don't like conflict, they're afraid to ask, and they lack confidence. So in order for you to be better at negotiating, what I would love you to do is to, after the seminar, give yourself a score between 1 and 5 for these skills here. preparation and planning, how good are you at listening, strategies and tactics, etc., etc. And then there's a scorecard at the end, which will give you a score and tell you what your self-assessment is. So finally, factors of success. So what's the legitimacy of your case? Just because it's legitimate doesn't mean to say you will succeed. Remember, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. You need to have, you need to have confidence in presenting it, courtesy to the other party, being able to adapt to the other party's style. You need to be good at rapport building, have incentives and trade-offs ready, and research the bigger picture. And in terms of key skills for negotiators, you need good listening skills and to be patient. You need to be open-minded, sensitive to cultural differences. You need to be people-orientated and always be willing to use your team's assistance. Look for consensus and synergy between yourselves, and have self-confidence that, you know, the opposition is going to smell weakness a mile off. So be self-confident, professionally competent, and have integrity, because that shines through. Also, you know, build personal relationships before negotiation. Appreciate the importance of building mutual trust. Study the culture and history of the other side, and especially any history of previous negotiation, and build on shared experiences. And finally, for negotiation skills, appreciate the other party will interpret what you say, what you do, and your facial expressions in the light of their culture and their language. Be alert to body language and silence. Show patience and tolerance. Respect status and seniority, which is for people from the blue culture. Please understand that the red cultures and the yellow cultures really have strong, the red cultures, strong machismo and honor, and the yellow cultures, oh, this courteousness is about saving face. So not only do you have to make sure people can save face, but also if you're backing somebody into a corner, give them a way out, give face so that they don't lose face, and be prepared for negotiations to continue post-agreement, especially with the Chinese. You know, you negotiate an agreement, you sign on the dotted line, but then life changes, things change, and they expect negotiation to keep going. And now for something completely practical. Focus on the outcome and not the process. So avoid getting emotionally tied up and giving emotional reactions to tactics. Remember, focus on the outcome, not the process, because firing bullets to make you emotionally react could well be part of the tactics of the other party. And remember, successful negotiation is not confrontational. It's a win-win-win. And when all else fails, keep calm and keep negotiating. So thank you very much, everyone.